I was born in 1938, immediately before the beginning of the Second World War, and I was raised in a family of teachers. My father was a teacher, my mother was a teacher, and I had 3 siblings, so we were 4 at the end. But my father died in the war. He was killed in Italy. So after the Second World War, my mother was alone with four children, and he didn't remarry anymore, so she had to raise 4 children on her own. And that was quite demanding for her. But she managed to provide a good education for all her 4 children, which was not very easy in these times, because things were not comparable to what we have nowadays. It was a very, very tough time to survive, simply to survive. My real education started after the Second World War, and is very much connected with the development of the Federal Republic of Germany. After the reconstitution of the country in '49 with the constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany, a new development started, and it was, of course, a development very much influenced by the United States. And the United States were also a kind of reference society for us. The democracy was a model, and we all looked to the other side of the ocean in these times. I got a normal education in one of these German high schools, and later on I had the opportunity to go to the university, and got a stipend of one of these very famous German foundations, which allowed me to study according to my own interests. And I started first with literature, philosophy and history, but later I switched to sociology, economics and political science. So I had a very long period of studies in these years. Learning was the major purpose. So the environment in which I grew up was an environment of learning. And the most important thing is it needs translations, new translations. Most of the translation available in other languages are fallacious, and partly highly misleading. I mean, we had many conferences on this issue in the meantime. It's a very interesting problem that of course, any translation is an interpretation. It's not, there is no such thing as a literal translation, but you can deviate more or less from the original, and and we very often have the situation that translations in other languages are done from the English translation, not from the German translation. So you have very often a situation where the English translation is used for Japanese translation, and the Japanese translation is used for Chinese translation. That I call this a Chinese whisper. You know, then you start with a word, and it ends up with a different word. My example is always you start with love, which is a very crucial term in our society, and if you go the way from English to Japanese to Chinese, you end up with luck. Because the Chinese always are searching for luck, not so much for love. So you get this kind of Chinese whisper, you know, and very often I think it is a distorted picture of Weber which is conveyed through the translations. But I should also emphasize there is no such thing as a literal translation. It's always an interpretation. And it depends on the knowledge of the interpreter, of the translator, how close he can get to the original. And sometimes you cannot get close to the original because the terms do not exist in a different language. Weber's language is very much informed by the legal debate in Germany, and many terms are legal terms which are confined to the German legal tradition and which cannot be translated in other languages. So you need substitutes for that. But sometimes it leads to a to a whole literature on issues which are produced by translation. One very interesting example is Parsons' translation of the Iron Cage. It has triggered off a whole literature on this idea of the iron cage, but it is a mistranslation of the original, which means not iron cage, not that there is something sitting in a cage, and then something looking outside upon him, and he wants to leave the cage. No, Weber's argument is these people like to be there. They want to be imprisoned, so to speak, in this kind of well-to-do situation in which they are in which they are covered, and he has an entirely different connotation with it. It is a lack of interest in transcending the existing order, being satisfied with the existing order. And it's not to be imprisoned in the sense of being forced from the outside. You want to be there. You have no desires anymore beyond the existing order. That is his idea, and he is really, of course, he doesn't like that. He wanted to have a mankind that is still able to transcend the existing order, to change it, to go ahead. And but this situation is such that this is prohibited, and this is a notion that is not conveyed exactly with this translation of Iron Cage. But you get a whole literature on Iron Cage. Even Mitzman's book has a title, "The Iron Cage," as a title on Max Weber. So I try to emphasize this notion of developmental history. And there is also a methodological device in Rickert's own work as to the difference between mere change on the one hand and evolutionary theory in the sense of a normative notion of evolution on the other hand. And he argues this is developmental history. It's a conditional teleological notion of development, and I was convinced that Weber's own approach can be reconstructed in these terms. It's a Eurocentric approach. I always maintain that this is a Eurocentric approach, but it is heuristic. It's not normative. It's not normative. Of course, Weber is very clear on this issue that only in the West things emerge that have universal significance and probably validity. Significance, of course. Capitalism is something that is really significant for mankind. Modern science is something that is significant for mankind. So nobody in the world nowadays can avoid the principle of modern science. In India, in China, wherever you go, it's modern science has the same kind of structure in all these civilizations. So there was something invented in the West that has penetrated the world, so to speak. But that is not to say the West is the highest civilization in the world, and all the others are deficient. And we will probably come back to that when we talk a little bit about Eisenstadt, because Eisenstadt started this idea of multimodernities exactly on this basis of a Weberian idea of a multiplicity of developmental histories. That there are many developmental histories, and that you have, and each civilization has its own way to cope with these challenges. That the Western world has produced from the 15th century onward, starting with the period of discoveries, then with Renaissance, with Reformation, with Enlightenment. It has changed the world, but it has not unified the world. The world is very, very different in its various corners because of cultural tradition that can cope with these challenges that are introduced by the West, partly peacefully, but also partly with force, with imperialism and colonialism and so on and so forth. A rationalization produces countervailing powers all the time. What is regarded from one viewpoint as rational can be regarded from another viewpoint as irrational, as non-rational. And he supplies also these paired concepts in which he tries to couch a different dimension of rationality, like instrumental and value rational, formal and substantive rationality, theoretical and practical rationality. These are elements where he tries to show, well, there is no such a thing as reconciliation between various forms of rationality. There's always this antinomy, conflict between. And if you push forward formal rationalization, then you will always have a counter argument that the result has to be evaluated from a substantive viewpoint, and the result might be regarded as something which is not acceptable. So the forces of production can be developed in capitalism to an extreme extent, but the result might be that the distribution of income is unjust. And then you evaluate this from a substantive, rational viewpoint, from a value viewpoint, and say, well, that is unjust. I don't want to have this result. I have to change it. So rationality is always it's always double. There's a double bind. One goes in this direction, one goes in the other direction, and there is not a reconciliation between various forms of rationality. It's always this idea of antinomy. It's room for emotion in the basic sociological terms because he emphasized the importance of affectual action and the relationship between affectual action and value rational action. Value rational action is deeply embedded in emotions, contrary to instrumental rational action, which is detached from emotions. But value rational action is very close related to emotions, emotional elements. It has to do with our identities, with our subjective meaning we give to our life. This has always affectual and value rational elements. You have these two irrational value spheres, art and erotics. They cannot be rationalized in the same way as it's true for power, for utility. In either case, there is a value involved, but it's a different type of value. And so you have two value spheres where you can argue there is no rationalization, there is only sublimation possible. That's art and erotics, sexuality. And then there are other spheres where you can have rationalization, but of a different kind, depending on the value that is at stake, the prime value that is at stake. So you can reconstruct the intermediate reflection in these terms. But it's always the idea that rationality is a multi-dimensional concept in which you encounter, so to speak, countervailing tendencies, and never a reconciliation, an easy reconciliation of different types of rationality. That's a terminological point, and the terminological point means that this distinction between value and purpose, as the German word is Wert und Zweck, value and purpose, is somewhat awkward. therefore I have reformulated this a little bit in arguing that Weber defines purpose as a success that becomes the cause of an action, and value as a validity that becomes the cause of an action. Then it makes sense, to say the anticipation of a success becomes the cause of an action. That would be instrumental, rational. And a validity, the conception or the notion of a validity, that becomes the cause of an action. That's value, rational. So I try to reformulate these two concepts of value and purpose. That's a literal translation of Wert and Zweck, because there is no action without a purpose. There is a double meaning of teleological. An action is always teleological in a general sense, because it's always couched in terms of means, ends, in one way or another, always. My solution for this problem, for this tricky conceptual problem, is simply to say purpose is the anticipation or the notion of a success that becomes the cause of an action, and value is a notion of a validity. And whether it's an ethical validity or another validity, a religious validity or whatever it might be, it doesn't matter. It's always the same type of cause of action, to do something for its own sake. It is one of Weber's argument that rationalization is a process that can be detected in every civilization, but different types of rationalization. The comparative studies in the sociology of religion provide us with different types of rationality. He maintains that the comparative studies are meant as a contribution to the sociology and typology of rationalism. And this is one of his very interesting insights, because contrary to the critique of religion we found in the early Marx or in Feuerbach and so on, for the theory of Weber argues that religion and rationality are not always countervailing powers. Religion is a force to develop rationality, and it's not confined to the Judeo-Christian tradition. You have the same in Buddhism. You have the same to a certain extent in Confucianism. There's no hierarchy, strictly speaking, between these various types of rationality. Typology and sociology of rationalism is the purpose of these comparative studies. Of course, also to identify the distinctiveness of the Western trajectory. That was his interest. I want to understand how come that in the West we have this peculiar development. And a development, by the way, which is not only significant for other civilizations, but also probably to a certain extent valid, has to be taken over. But always in mixture with their own traditions. And I think that is what Eisenstadt always had in mind when he tried to reinvent this idea of multiplicity. He calls multiple modernities, which I don't like the term, because it's even multiple modernity, or it's modernities, either way. But he says multiple modernities. Okay, that's not important. His idea was there cannot be a uniformity in the way in which even new inventions that has to be taken over are appropriated, because there is always a cultural tradition that has either strong resistance or weak resistance against this imposition from the outside. And therefore you get a multiplicity of modernities, not only one modernity. I don't like the word post-secular, because it's not post-secular, it is secular. Secular, and within a secular frame, you have still religion, and religion is an option. It's no doubt about that, and it makes a lot of sense to argue, if you want to transcend your immanent life, if you want to give meaning to your life, you need something that is beyond the existing life, and religion is an offer for such a relationship to something that is beyond, that is higher than your own existence, that you strive for something that is beyond your own existence. So religion will always have a viable background for human beings, as long as they are searching for meaning. But it's not the only way, and there are many people around who do not accept the religious interpretation of transcendence. They want other modes of transcendence, secular modes of transcendence, which is very difficult to achieve. It's very difficult to achieve. But nevertheless, you have now the situation that living without religion has the same dignity as living with religion. And that was not true in the 15th century. There was no such thing as an option, that you could either be religious or non-religious. You had to be a member of a religious group. There is no human life without an attempt to give meaning to one's life. And there is not only outer need, as we experience very often, that the people have lack of resources and so on. There's always an inner need, and you have to solve the inner need. Human beings search for meaning, for interpretation of their life, and insofar religion will never disappear. I never read Weber in this way, that Weber argues religion will disappear. No, religious, but it has a different status under modern conditions than it used to have in the past. And it's very important for a proper understanding of the political constitution, because the state, according to Weber, has priority over all the other meaning producing, meaning supplying institutions. The state itself is not a meaning supplying institution. It's a forum, or under which you can have these different attitudes, where religion plays a role, where non-religious conviction play a role, and they must be all regarded as equally with regard to their access to the state. The modern state is the forum under which you have this possibility of options to solve the meaning problem. The state itself doesn't solve the meaning problem. It's only the formal frame under which you can solve the meaning problem. So the state is not the embodiment of meaning. The state is an instrument to allow for a multiplicity, for a pluralism of meaning producing and meaning searching enterprises. My suspicion would be that in the long run, even if you have now a theocracy, like in some of these Islamic countries, the search for an optional interpretation of meaning, the search for meaning, will prevail in the long run. And there's always this problem of how to guide your life and how to die. The demon is, of course, not. Demon means your own destiny. You have chosen, and there the decisive point is choice. It's much easier to live in a constellation where the meaning problem is solved for you. You need to produce the meaning of your life yourself. It's your. You have to choose the demon of your life. It's a choice. That's very, very crucial. It's a choice, and it's not just a choice like you choose Coca-Cola vis-a-vis Sprite. It's an existential choice, and the existential choice has consequences for your entire life.